Welcome to Seek Justice, a podcast that takes a deep dive into the nuances of criminal justice. Good morning, Dennis.
Morning, Eric. How are you?
Pretty good. You mentioned today that you might want to talk about costs and where the funds go. Is our bucket leaky, or is it going to actually be used properly? If that analogy makes any sense.
Yeah. Well, and I think people are generally aware of the fact that the preponderance of their local tax dollar goes to justice costs, being police, sheriffs, road patrol, personnel, jail, courts, etc. And then a very big proportion of their state tax dollar goes to support what in most states is the largest cost to their system using state dollars. Often not the largest budget item, but some of the other budget items like Department of Social Services and whatnot draw down from federal funds. And so while they might have larger budgets, they're also drawing down a larger percentage of non-state dollars. So if you consider, as the jargon goes, a state program, which is an odd way to describe a Department of Corrections, but nonetheless I've heard it described that way, is that the largest share of state program dollars goes to corrections. And so you can examine this question from both the state and local perspective, thinking about the state perspective, because a lot of the local spending is kind of reflective of that. What does the state not cover? The locals have to pick it up. The state dollars may cover support for some of the law enforcement. Some federal money may be going into that, but familiar enough with the state budget in Michigan to make some general comments about that. So you've got a budget in Michigan, a state with 9 million people, corrections budget of $2.2 billion. Wow. And that's all state dollars. That runs, 31 or 32 prisons. I think they reopened one of the ones we closed. And under the supervision in the prison system is about 44,000 people. In our state, it's kind of unified in that prisons and probation and parole and community programs are all in one budget, as opposed to other states that may have separate budgets for those. So you've got to do some addition to get these similar apples-to-apples comparisons. But with 44,000 state prisoners, an estimate of about 17,000 people on parole, maybe twice that on probation, you got about 70,000 people plus under some form of supervision. And when you start to do the math, if you just divide that budget up, 70,000 people, $2.2 billion, you get a pretty expensive per person cost. And so once you examine where those dollars go, you see that about 85% of the dollars go for personnel, and most of that personnel is prison personnel, where the staffing patterns, as they call it, are steep. The ratio of staff to offender is higher than it is if you're on parole, where you might have caseloads in the hundreds, 200-300 people in your caseload.
So for a prison with 1,000 prisoners, or is it like a 10 to 1 ratio, or?
Well, it's not that simple, because it depends on what custody levels you're running. Staffing patterns for maximum security, medium security, minimum security prisons are all very different. You look at custody staff, you look at personnel staff, and I'm not sure how many folks are really want to get into those details. We could do that research and get into some of that detail. Maybe we can post some of that, but needless to say, it's expensive. And the general figure that we use, it's about $45,000 on average per person per year in prison. And that's just looking at that prison budget, which is important. If the $2.2 billion budget in Michigan, somewhere in the range of 80-85% of that money is for prisons. And then within that number, 80-85% of that money is for personnel. And so when you've got personnel costs, this is expensive, and not that they pay correctional officers all that well. They don't. They pay better here than other states. But you've also got the cost of benefits, you got the cost of pensions and retirement, and then you've got to pay the cost for people who are retired to receive those pensions and benefits. And then on top of it, you've got things like lawsuits that are, pandemic across all corrections.
Right. A whole bunch of the money gets hemorrhaged off to the lawyers.
Millions and millions of dollars, and just so much investigation and cost, and a lot of legal fees and things of that nature. And then related to personnel, you've got technological fees for, IT and communication capabilities and whatnot. And so the costs are a variable to consider when asking the questions. So is it worth it? Does it work? And it depends on what your measure is. I mean, if we're running a safe prison system where there's not a lot of altercations and deaths and things of that nature in the prison system, which I think it's fair to say that's true in Michigan, although not without its problems, then that's one way to consider safety. You don't have people escaping all the time, et cetera, et cetera. And parole supervision I think, is pretty good, regardless of the high caseloads. But then when you look at another measure, which is return to prison, one might argue that anything over a 50% failure rate, return to prison, would be something less than success. And we've got, depending on how you measure recidivism, you've got another crime that's committed that's one form of recidivism, another conviction is another form of recidivism, and a return to prison, and those numbers are all very different. So there really is an ongoing debate that the public is not too particularly aware of what happens every budget year when considering what these costs are and whether the cost of running the Department of Corrections goes up or down, and whether or not lawmakers who are controlling the budget are bringing into that discussion the relative success or failure,
and all the individual programs within it.
And then as we've talked about ad nauseum, the frequency of the turnaround of state legislators, with people running for re-election every 2 years in the House, and most places, although some it's 4 years in the House and 4 years in the Senate. How much history do you have? And you walk into a budget and you're a junior or a freshman member of the legislature.
And you bring all your own policy people. You don't necessarily inherit the policy wonks from before because your people know better.
Well, it's you think people you continue on from your campaign, which of course is interesting because it's not necessarily the same skill set that you need, but it's reward kind of stuff, and that jobs don't pay all that well anyway. And there is a surprising amount of staff in legislatures that turn over when a senator term limits or is defeated and another senator comes in. That staff continue to work in the Senate for somebody. It's like any kind of job. You're in your field and your specialty area, et cetera. So you do have some legacy of institutional memory with staffing. But the major point is that if you're a freshman or an incoming, and this is a budget cycle that goes through every year, I mean, how much do you raise your hand and say, well, geez, I just have a general question. Why does it cost so much? And what are you doing with all this money? And how does that connect with the recidivism rate? And, when you're a freshman or a younger legislator, you're not going to be looked upon very favorably if you delay these hearings, which are very, very fast paced, particularly around the budget, with a lot of detail,
Right, and just come in there and ask these questions that are not really trivial to answer necessarily. That's going to slow things down to a halt, and then.
And to what end? I mean, what do you do about it? I mean, you've got governors recommending budgets. Those budgets pick up from where they were last year. These costs are relatively unavoidable. And if somebody said, well, I don't want to spend $2.2 billion in the corrections department, I only want to spend $2 billion. So what do we do?
Right. You say, well, what do you want to get off? Right. What do you want to take away?
Well, right. And so you're in the executive and you've got this budget, and the first thing we would do is we would create what we called internally the stupid list. And you want to explain to legislators, particularly the ones that are asking this question, we want to cut. What would we cut? Well, you put on the list stuff that's stupid. I mean, you look at it, several $1 million of cuts or $100 million of cuts. You look at elimination of parole, elimination of probation supervision, cutting out, reducing health care programs.
So
and there's costs. There's costs you can't avoid.
When you say a stupid list, you put things on there that you can't possibly remove, so that if you ask to remove it, you're going to look stupid. Is that?
Well, right, and it's realistic. I mean, you see governors all the time, and I dealt with this under Governor Granholm, where the revenue is just not enough. And so you start with this internal executive debate on across the board cuts. And you say, well, revenue's down 10%, therefore we need to cut expenses 10%. We're going to do across the board 10%.
From everybody, right.
Well, then each agency comes up with their own list. And if you're in the Office of Aging, you say, well, what we'll cut is, response to healthcare dilemmas for the aging. And so then you have, if that gets moving, then you have a lobby that's going to come out and say, well, you're just going to let these old people die. And there's statistics that will show that since you instituted these types of programs, you've saved lives. Or you say, well, let's look at early childhood education. We're going to cut out breakfast programs for kids, or we're going to cut out, an early on program, a preschool program of some kind. And then the data shows that program has a very positive impact on healthcare costs up the road, or educational costs, or even prison costs. And there is longitudinal data that shows correlations between future imprisonment and poor healthcare and poor education, and so that's where the debate goes. But when you're in corrections, now you're dealing with public safety. Well, we could just let, 600 people out of prison early. We need an executive order. We need law changed, and we could do that. And the legislature's like, well, we don't want to do that. Or we could reduce healthcare costs by cutting this out or cutting that out. And then we're going to increase lawsuits. Well, we don't want to do that. Increase lawsuits. We don't want to do that. We'll eliminate, increased caseloads, which does, in fact, create more crime, more opportunities for crime. Well, we don't want to do that. And so eventually they abandon the 10% across the board cut, and they go into more specific cuts in particular agencies, which is very, very, very time consuming. And corrections very often will not get the hit that the other departments get because it's such a complex and nuanced issue. Well, and the one might argue that the top priority of state government is to protect the citizens. Right. The priority of all of state government is protect people, protect them from everything, not just crime, protect them from disease and safety issues, et cetera. And so corrections comes up big on that, and it's tough. So what you see are generally escalating costs across the board in all states' corrections agencies. And when you examine those states that have seen a reduction, you see that the reduction has come across, not surprisingly, by cutting the major cost of personnel within the prison system. And the way that you do that is you reduce the prison population. You don't mess with your staffing patterns, although there is some of that. I mean, depending on the custody level, staffing patterns are going to be necessarily higher than lower. And if you cut those staffing patterns too much, you're going to put your employees at risk, you're going to put other inmates at risk. But there's a sweet spot that you can get to, and maybe there is some reductions there. But for the most part, every budget just picks up from last year. And when you've got costs that cannot be controlled, such as increased costs because of pensions, increased costs because electricity is higher or gas is higher, transportation costs. These are what they call economics, and they go up every year, and they become an increasing percentage of your budget. And so you look at a $2.2 billion budget, and your legislator or you're in the executive, you say, well, what can we cut? Well, there's not that much. Yeah, because all the other little bits that you could cut, like pensions or staff wages or something, it's just going to infuriate people. Those are all pitfalls. But the thing that's actually moves the needle is reducing the prison population. That's not going to cause any one piece of the system to lash out against you, because obviously the prisoners want fewer prison population, and it's just the general population might see that as, wait, you're letting bad guys go, I guess is the main downside, the main political struggle with that. You're not going to get sued because you're taking away a pension or because you're cutting a job or something, but you could potentially get big wins there by reducing the prison population. Well, and that's it takes a longer term view and takes an awful lot of leadership, and it's got to be bipartisan. It's got to be bicameral, meaning all three branches of government need to be involved. Judiciary less involved. It's a parole issue. But, the controversy of letting people go early is a whole lot higher controversy than doing some work on the front end so that fewer people go in the first place. And in order to make that work, you've got to do some additional investment. And if you invest now, you may save costs later, but it isn't going to cut your budget this year.
Right.
Because you've got to implement, you've got to get some success going. You've got, months and months, if not years of time that has to elapse before you can realize that admissions have gone down,
Right.
and in order for that to happen, you've got to have a very, very tight set of communications and then deliberate expectations with the judiciary that their sentencing practices will support what you're trying to do. And
Right.
since judiciary is independent, that means that you can offer, but you can't tell the judiciary what to do. I mean, they're fiercely independent. In fact, their budget is usually behind a screen. You only know the amount. You don't know what it's spent for. It's one of the more incredible aspects of the justice budget is that the court's budget comes in as a package. And because they're an independent branch of government, the legislative branch has no, they control the power of the purse, but they don't have the power to be able to say, well, we don't want to fund this, we don't want to fund that, we want to cut it. Now that varies from state to state, but
Right.
as a general rule, it's the case. And so you're caught up in this difficult set of circumstances that lead you toward ever expanding budgets. And so compare all that mess to the mess of raising taxes and the pushback from that.
Right.
And so that's a heavy lift. You're going to increase the gas tax, as they're trying to do in Michigan, by I believe that the proposal is out there is 45% increase. That's a lot of money per gallon, going from $2.50 to $3. I mean, we'll soon be what's a gallon of gas cost in Spain, American dollars?
I have no idea.
You don't drive?
I very rarely buy gas, and when I do, they sell it in euros per liter. So you'd have to convert both the numerator and the denominator. But it's way more expensive here than it is in the U.S. in general.
Right. Well, and it's for the very reason we're talking about. That's what funds the government. I mean,
Right.
And so, the challenge for a politician, for an elected official, is no matter what I do, I'm going to get grief.
Sure.
I'm either going to cut expenses or I'm going to raise revenue. I'm going to do a little bit of both, which is usually the way you go. And so you can show that you're, doing these more surgical, what they call surgical cuts or more precision cuts in different agencies across the board. But if you're not cutting personnel, then you're not really going to get into a whole lot of cost savings. You got 14,000 people, probably more than that now, who work for the Department of Corrections in the state of Michigan. 14,000. So, good Lord, if you don't control those costs, which are very hard to control, then you're not going to really do much by way of cutting. And the same is true in all agencies, although some are more staff intensive than others. And so it's really difficult to get at these issues, very, very difficult, time consuming and politically challenging.
Yeah, so it sounds like if we made you the dictator of you can control all these decisions for something, it sounds like the goal would be realize that the costs are going to steadily rise over the next few years, but implement 100 different things in different parts of the system that we think is going to slowly lower it over, it's going to be lower after 20 years, but after 5 years, it's still probably going to continue to have risen. But then long term, all of our investments in the preschools and all this stuff is going to bring it all down in the long term. But that can't possibly work because of democracy.
Well, and consider the medium term. So, when you've got a House, representatives in the House that are running every 2 years, 5 years is a long time.
Right.
Well, you've got a Senate that's serving every 4 years. 5 years is a bit of a length of time, let alone 10 and 20. And so your motivation to make tough decisions that are unpopular, either on the cut side or on the revenue side, or a bit of both, is going to change somewhat depending on where you sit as an elected official. If you're and what you want your future to be. I mean, if you're a House member, you want to end up being a senator. If you're a senator, do you want to being a congressman? Do you want to end up being governor? If you're a governor, do you want to end up being a congressman? I mean, do you want to end up being president? Now, of course, in this election cycle in this country, in the U.S., since we've got such a controversial president, we've got over 20 people running for president, including, mayors,
right.
State legislators, former legislators. I mean, just a whole panoply of people that is unusual with that size of a group of people that are running. And the first debates are coming up in June, so it should be pretty fascinating. But where you sit and how long you're there and what you want your future to be politically is a huge part of this issue.
Right.
And it's fascinating when you're talking to legislators who will have a set of values that come clearly through in conversations one-on-one, and what that conversation is like, and how that conversation is much different when you're actually in a hearing, and that legislators standing in the committee structure, particularly on the fresh end, right, maybe
Right.
quite low, they're not able to ask a lot of questions, get called in, and they may not be in a power position. These, the way that budget decisions are made, while you've got votes in committee and whatnot, it's all done by leadership behind closed doors, and then the ability for the leadership to control the vote. And so you have the House Dems and the House Republicans. Those are different organizational entities that take positions, and then they try to keep their members in line. And when they're in line, that's when you have, unanimous votes out of committee, or postponement, or taking it off the schedule. All these tricks of the trade that can postpone or speed up legislation into our budgets. And so it gets very complicated with that too. Who's the Speaker of the House, and where's the Speaker of the House want to go, and what's his or her politics? I mean, these are enormously complex issues. And at the end of the day, one would wonder, so how much do they actually have to do with the budget per se? And the question that we open with is, so is the money working? Is the bang worth the buck? And and at the end of the day, given the justice system is not functioning at a very high level of success, it must be pretty obvious to people that that's not one of the major questions going into the budget.
Right.
It's all this other stuff. And not to minimize the freight train of what a budget looks like, and these economics that you can't change year to year to year. It's very, very tough stuff. And so budgets escalate, taxes rise, we pay an increasing portion to corrections, and there you have it.
Yeah. So is it? I mean, I guess on the other hand, this incredible inertia to affect change has its positive side as well. You don't get really radical people elected that say we're going to close all the prisons, or we're going to quadruple the number of prisons. But I guess the fact that they're in this political molasses all the time means that yes, change is hard, but also breaking the system even more so is also difficult.
Well, and generally, the rule of politics is that you promise a lot of stuff to get elected, and if you promise the right stuff to the majority of people who vote, then you'll get elected, and then you've got to deliver on those promises. And one of the interesting analyses that some have done, and there's some history on this that you can find research-wise, it can always be done again, is to say, well, how much was corrections or crime and justice even talked about during the election? So you look at the last gubernatorial race here that Governor Gretchen Whitmer won, who has a storied career in the justice system, both as a senator, where she was in deep leadership on budget issues and policy issues, and then for a short time a prosecutor, when the prosecutor in Lansing, Michigan, was convicted of sex offense and had to be replaced, and she was the replacement. So she knows all about corrections and justice issues very, very clearly, but it didn't come up. I don't recall seeing one article, questionnaire, news article, media of any kind, anything that had to do with justice, anything that had to do with corrections. And so now that she's governor, is it a big issue? Well, not particularly.
Right.
But until you get to the budget, and when you get to the budget, it's like, well, corrections is going up. There's nothing we can do about it unless we want to do, stupid things. Right. And so what do we do? And what did you run on? Well, she ran on, the phrase, which is pretty well known here in politics, we need to fix the damn roads. It was one of her phrases, which was interesting. It was very effective, too, because she was clearly angry about it, and, swearing about it was like,
right.
oh my,
right.
The damn roads. But now that's what she's got to do, and in order to do that, she needs to raise the gas tax. Right. Well, that she's not going to get probably the full amount of money she wants to raise the gas tax. What is that primary issue, both political and budget? How does that affect corrections? which has got $2.2 billion budget? Well, the answer is not much.
Yeah.
I mean, perhaps not at all.
Yeah, I mean, roads is such a tangible issue that everyone has to deal with. Everyone has an opinion on are the roads good or not.
Yeah.
Thankfully, not everyone needs to think about prisons all the time.
Right.
Because unless a crime is visited upon you, or you commit one, the justice system isn't a big part of your day as much as roads are. Right.
Right. Well, and the unlike roads, the opinion of voters relative to justice issues is predictable and not particularly productive nor positive, because their attitude is, well, lock them up, throw away the key, kill them, wipe them out. They don't deserve, fair treatment, let alone, good treatment. And so if you're a politician, you don't really want to go there.
Right.
There's not a lot of votes in it. Although now that, as we've talked about in other podcasts, where you've got an increasing number of former prisoners that are voting and can vote, and efforts underway that I've participated in to get them registered to vote, they can and will have a greater voice over time, and then their voice too will be heard much more clearly. And that's one of the things to think about up the road a little bit, is the degree to which that will change over the course of many, many years to come.
What sort of, if you could pick your ideal candidate for criminal justice reform, would it be? I mean, it would be someone that has worked in that industry, like maybe a defense lawyer or a community activist.
Yeah, well, it's
or just someone that's aware of the issues and concerned.
Thinking politically, rather than substantively to begin with, since it's a political question. Prosecutors often make better candidates for higher office than other people in the justice system, because the general public's view of being tough is reflected in their history. What did you do in the justice system?
I put a bunch of people away.
I locked them up, and so then you can look at a continuum or a range of perspective on a former prosecutor, whether they were more conservative, more liberal, et cetera, more creative, less creative. And then that is an additional test. Thinking, though...
So prosecutors are more electable than defense attorneys?
Yes, as a general rule. Yes. What did you do? Right. Well, my job was to defend people and try to keep them from going to prison. Whether they were guilty or not, well, we didn't really talk about that.
Right, exactly. So, but that's, however, it's our growing opinion that we need to reduce the prison population. So it seems like the defense attorneys would be more aligned with that model, but maybe not.
Well, substantively, an interesting point. Substantively, you will find, because many systems don't have a public defender system, they have an appointed attorneys system. You've got a certain level of knowledge and intellect in the defense bar, driven by a combination of their education and experience that you draw from. And if you were to look at the curricula for law school, you would see very, very little, if anything at all, about alternative sentencing.
Right.
So, it's not like defense attorneys are educated, schooled, and particularly well experienced in a plea bargain system where they cut a deal, and the deal has to do with months behind bars or nothing behind bars and not so much any of the details. So I think it's a general rule. I'd say that they're a little less prepared than we'd like to see them. If you're in a public defender system where that's an entity, an organization that's funded, then you're going to have a greater degree of organizational history and experience to draw from. But that's not to say that lawyers of any kind are particularly well schooled and well versed in anything other than the law. If you take one thing you can say is that you can't get out of law school and pass the bar if you're an idiot. I mean, you've got to have some brain power, and so you're going to be smart. You're probably going to be pretty well organized. You're probably going to be studious, or you wouldn't have gotten that far. And so those are good skills, for running for office. Kamala Harris, a former prosecutor, African-American woman running for president. We're looking into some of her justice issues. And you know right off the bat that that's somebody that you could sit down and talk to, and she knows what she's talking about.
Yeah.
And she's going to be, because she's studious and now policy oriented, she's going to be much more reflective and substantive when she considers how to respond to questions or what policies she wants to promote. And she's likely to be quite realistic over this whole thing that you raised a moment ago about long-term versus short-term. Mm-hmm. And so her learning curve on this set of issues is relatively short,
right.
or not particularly steep compared to the others. But having said that, what does it matter when you're running for president?
Right.
And there it's really about opinion and whether or not your opinion is going to be favorably,
it's more about likability at this point.
Well, I mean, I like your opinion on justice, but as president, what are you going to do? You're not going to be running for president and say, I'm going to reform the justice system at the end of the
state
day.
Level.
Right, which is where the push needs to happen. Now, you can talk about the federal government's capability to assist states to reform the system, which is quite incredible. Given the
is that a matter of here's some budget for you if you change some of your policies on these things? Can they dangle conditional budget?
Well, sort of. The purpose of the money, which is legislated,
okay,
is to participate in reform efforts that result in less recidivism, i.e.,
right.
less crime or violations. And you and I know, as we've talked, that the biggest reason people are in prison is not because of the crime they committed. It's because of their violation behavior while they're under supervision.
Right.
So that's a nuance that you certainly aren't going to get into when you're running for president of the United States.
For sure.
But I think that, if you were a former legislator, less a congressperson, but perhaps a state legislator, you're going to be more aware of and involved in substantive issues around justice, because most state legislators have got to know enough about it to be able to do the votes and whatnot. But it is a bit of a specialty area too, where you've got a handful of state legislators that are known for their intellect and their substantive understanding, and they're go-to people. Mm-hmm. So that somebody that says, hey, I'm more concerned about the roads and education, there's this vote coming up, how do I parlay that vote into helping me get what I want over here? What kind of a deal can we cut? That's how you get the votes in the first place, right? So right. It's all interrelated, but you've got to have an educated electorate and an educated legislative branch in order to be able to promote this. But back to your question about the feds, they have dollars that are appropriated through the Second Chance Act that if you apply for them in a competitive application process, you will receive several $1 million, depending on the grant award, over a couple of years to institute reforms, which could have short-term, medium-term, longer-term effect, and has the great value of not having to spend state dollars to begin with. The challenge, though, and this is pandemic, is that once that federal money's gone, it goes away.
Yeah.
And while the federal money requires what they call a sustainability plan, it's usually very vague, and you're saying stuff in the application you can't possibly deliver.
Right.
That that you're going to predict in 3 years that the legislature will pick up the dollars for these programs that help people.
Right.
When helping people is seen as being soft on crime, and do we start that whole conversation over again, right? About all the things that go into that. It's very, very complicated. Somebody said to me the other day, I can't remember who it was. I think it was one of the people working for me, a construction worker working on my house. So, is it getting better? Is it going to work? Are these things going to take hold? And I said, I wasn't in a particularly good frame of mind, but I said, no, not in my lifetime. And here I'm approaching retirement age.
All data points to no.
All data points in the wrong direction. You see pockets of states. I'm working in Connecticut, as you know, and they're taking hold. They've had a decrease in their prison population. I'll examine while I'm there the degree that their budget's gone down. It's an interesting fact that in states, Michigan, for example, when we closed prisons, et cetera, the budget did not go down. Costs for a particular area went down, but at the same time, costs in other areas went up.
Right, because if you have a budget of $2 billion or whatever, and you can save some costs somewhere else, that's you don't want to then report back, oh, we don't actually need quite so much money next year.
Right.
You're gonna say, well, all right, well, now we have this extra money that we've saved. What can we spend it on?
I'll give you an example of why this is legitimate, very legitimate, is that any corrections department has a list of capital issues, infrastructure issues. You've got a lot of buildings, you've got a lot of prisons, and they have boilers, and they have roofs and windows. And like a house, I mean, you've got to take care of this stuff. And so, at any given time, you can go to a corrections department and say, let me see your capital outlay list. And it's a list that's a mile long and enough appropriation to do certain things. But instead of replacing the roof, you patch the roof. It's the same thing that we have to do with our own pocketbooks. So if you have some leeway because costs for personnel have gone down, that's immediately taken up with things around capital outlay.
Sure.
It in fact may be one of the reasons that you're doing the reform efforts in the first place is because your infrastructure is crumbling, and you say we can't continue to spend this much money over here. This money that we have,
the legislators aren't going to give us any more, so we need to figure out a way to within our own ecosystem pinch pennies here to spend them over there.
Right. So, but you get back to this who in the state is motivated to take the longer term view, and notwithstanding annual budget pressures, but to start digging in. And in Connecticut, we see that in a state in the report that came out of the Sentencing Project. Mark Maurer, Steve DeBoer, and I wrote 5 states that have had good decarceration policies. Connecticut was one of the ones that we examined, and they had some prodigious gains, and yet the recidivism rate has not changed much. And the folks that are in the trenches in the communities working with people have not seen a lot of difference. Even though they've had a remarkable run. Governor Malloy, that was governor for the state for many years, is gone, and now there's a new governor. And after all the great things that governor did that we highlighted in our report, people looking around and saying, well, it really hasn't affected me much. I don't have any more housing, employment, social services for these guys. They're still getting released without any supervision. This incredible percentage there. I want to say it's in the 35-40% range compared to other states. They max out of prison only 15% of the time, and so people are hitting the streets with nothing, and they're homeless the day that they're released. And this is happening across the board. And so the communities in Connecticut have formed a reentry collaborative, and that's who I'll be working with in the coming year, led by a really nice connection with the university system, University of Central Connecticut, and professor policy wonk there by the name of Andrew Clark, who's doing a great job thinking about it. He'd make a nice guest when we start bringing guests in, because his perspective, he worked in the legislature as a staff person, been working with the executive. He's a researcher, data cruncher, policy wonk, et cetera. He's a brilliant young guy. Well, young compared to me, older than you, but fascinating stuff. And I'm very excited about it because it's one of the few times that the work I'm doing is done at the bequest of communities rather than the state.
I like it. Right.
Yeah, I like it too. I think it's going to be worth, a couple dedicated shows at some point. We may want to do one in Hartford one time too.
One thing you mentioned in passing was the concept of alternative sentencing. It strikes me, and in my layman's ignorance, it seems like one good way to reduce prison population might be to make sure that all the judges around the state or country are really informed about the positive effects of sentencing that isn't sending someone to prison.
Yeah.
And also the negative consequences of sending someone to prison, to learn among all the other prisoners. It seems like that's a particular point where you could move the needle quite a bit if you could just get the actual people that are making the decision to send someone to prison or not, if they could say no more than they say yes. Is that reasonable, or is the problem because the judges are some of the judges are elected that they have to maintain this stuff on crime malarkey?
As ever, not a good question, but a complicated response. And so the challenge here is the independence of the judiciary, many of whom are elected, and even if they're appointed, they're still independent. And so unlike the executive branch where you can issue an order and your state agencies need to follow the order, And if you're head of a department, then your expectation is that your staff will do what they're told to do, because the chain of command and the leadership is not foster independence. Right? It's a chain of command. That's not true in the judiciary.
Yeah, I was going to say judges must be fiercely independent. It's got to be like herding cats.
Well, and that means that if you want to motivate or work with the judiciary to get some different outcomes, you really have to work with each of them.
Right.
And wow, that's complicated because there's so many judges and they each have their own predisposition. Now, one of the places that, if you're a judge, what did you do before that? Well, preponderance of judges, all of whom are lawyers in most states. Some states don't require you to be a lawyer to be a judge, which is pretty
really,
yeah. But you come from prosecution,
right? And
so you've got that bent rather than defense, which has got another bent. So you come in with a philosophical predisposition. You may come in with what was your philosophy, or what did you say to the public when you were running for office or before you were appointed, and there's your record. And so that's that. So now let's look at the data, and let's look at the percentage that a single judge is using options short of prison or prison.
Right.
Compare them, and you see that varies widely, not just from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, where there may be in any particular jurisdiction 2 or 3 judges. You're not going to see solidarity necessarily in a jurisdiction. Well, all these 3 judges are the same. No. One of the judges is much more conservative than the other. One of the judges sentences 85% of the people before him or her to prison, while the other one does 50, and the third one does 20. And you can see, well, 2 of them were former prosecutors, one was a former defense attorney, and so what you do is you try to, you put stuff together for them. You might pass a law, which is a very smart way to go. Many states have done this, over 40, have passed what's called the Community Corrections Act. And that Community Corrections Act has as its mission the creation within the local court systems of alternatives to imprisonment that will both improve the use of the local jail system, but will also result in an appropriate use of prison. Those are the kind of political terms that you use. And in that regard, Michigan is one of these states. I ran that Community Corrections Act when I was executive director of the Office of Community Corrections. That was created as a result of that law. And we created voluntary boards locally with judges as the chairperson. So you've got them in a decision making, and then they use some dollars that we put together to examine the very things that you indicated in your question. If we give them options and educate them about the benefits of non-prison sentences and the detriments of prison sentences, right, then will they change? And the answer is yes, they will, because you can see that the recidivism rate for people returning to crime or returning to prison is obviously going to be greater for the people that spend time in prison. And so you've got data right off the bat, and then you can create alternative sentencing programs and the programs behind them, whether they're employment, alcohol, substance abuse, work programs, et cetera, that are used to motivate the judges to use them instead. And it can be incredibly effective. We're very effective in that in Michigan. We cut prison admissions down by double digits.
Okay, so my intuition is correct that that's a particular point where in the pipe where you can divert a lot of, I was sort of imagining however the pharmaceutical companies woo doctors into using their particular drug, like take all the judges out on a cruise or something and educate them in a certain way, or I don't know, there must be some way to, get people together and tell them about the data, like you say, and you don't tell them what to do, but you say you can draw your own conclusions, and here's the data that we have, and et cetera, et cetera.
Well, and in spite of what I said about their independence, I mean, there are judicial organizations. Each state has judges associations, and they do have court administrations, and those entities provide education and networking capabilities and conferences and webinars. You get continuing credit units, and so you work with those organizations to get in front of the judges, and then you can in an educational setting have a panel of judges that were sort of born again.
Right.
They were hardcore, and then they drank the Kool-Aid, and this is what they've seen. And they talk about personal examples, and some of them so incredibly compelling. You've got good judicial involvement in drug court programs and mental health court programs, and in some states, Louisiana, for example, I've done some work, re-entry courts that are dedicated to specific types of target populations and being creative, and you can fund those, and there's ways to get at it. But it's longer term stuff too.
Right.
And if you end up successful at the entire educational and development effort and start a pilot project and show that in that particular jurisdiction after 2 or 3 years that the recidivism numbers improved, maybe you can expand it, and then you're into a 3 to 5 year process. And shall we go back to the conversation about the election cycle? I mean, it's what you have to do in a state is you have to do everything.
Yeah, everything all the time.
You got to do everything all the time. You got to get at it. And if you're going to do everything, it's good to have a chief executive, a governor, who runs collaboratively and gets good support from these various associations and promises them some studious exploration of ways to improve efficiency, which is a better way to say cut costs, and improve outcomes. But you talk about it in the first sense of what am I going to do to make our state safer?
Right.
And then you start to measure, and it can look at recidivism rates, return to prison or return to crime rates of people that are in these alternative sentencing programs compared to going to prison, et cetera. And they're always better, and they're always less costly.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not necessarily what is motivating a judge. The judge is certainly interested in rehabilitation, but that may not be his or her primary goal for a particular sentencing. It may be punishment.
Right.
Period. And then the argument is, well, that doesn't punish him. I want him locked up. And then you get into for how long?
Yeah,
how long does it take for you not to have freedom to be punished? It ain't 10 years.
Yeah. True. Thank you for listening. If you like what you've just heard, you can support us by telling a friend or sharing us on social media. All of our episodes can be found on our website, seekjustice.fm. If you'd like to get in touch with us, we can be reached at seekjusticefm@gmail.com or via our Twitter account @seekjusticefm. See you next week.